This is American Political Thought for the week of March 22nd through March 26th. This is Module 3 in our discussion of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And this discussion will cover Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 5. We left off with Chapter 4 in the last module. And we'll cover through Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 4. So here's where we are. As I've already laid out the order and the nature of the chapters in Volume 1, Part 1, which is the introduction to the reader to America. And we've seen the pre-political factors that shaped and led to the rise of the American regime in geography and religion and social culture and in economics. In Chapter 3, we saw the conceptual or ideational basis, the sovereignty of the people, which is equivalent to the doctrine of natural rights. And as I already suggested at the beginning of the second module, the sovereignty of the people is one of de Tocqueville's critical terms. That's both, in some ways, it's also a synonym for or a part of the larger concept of democracy, which includes equality of conditions, the economic basis of which was Chapter 3, the fluidity of property and the breaking up of estates that leads to the undermining of the social and political foundations of aristocracy, and also leads to as you'll come to see, although de Tocqueville doesn't use this term, although you'll see when we come to critical chapter in Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 5, this is what you could say that the discussion of the property foundation of economic life in America in Chapter 3 and Part 1, Volume 1 is the ground of the middle class economy, which the middle class, as you're going to see, is de Tocqueville's understanding of the health and strength of the American regime. So by the way, I'll plant this question in your head. So, and to anticipate where we'll finish up with this tonight's discussion, the beginning of Part 2 in Volume 1, which is discussing how America really is a democracy, what he means by that, and we'll see it's a certain understanding of majority rule. So in a democracy, the majority rules. So wherever the spirit and habits of the majority goes, that's where the politics will go. And so you'll see that for Tocqueville, analyzing the experiences, the inclinations, the opinions, and an identity of the majority in America is the key to understanding the present of American politics and the future. Because wherever the middle class goes in America, that's where policy will go, that's where the regime will go. And as you'll see, much of his prediction of what will come in the United States and throughout the world is bound up with this issue. So Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is one of the critical chapters in Democracy in America. It's a long chapter because it's essentially performing two functions. The first function is, remember, in the first 4 chapters, we have the pre-political dimensions of the American regime. And again, remember, the 8 chapters in Volume 1 are roughly historical. So in some ways, Chapter 5 begins the emergence of American political institutions. And as you'll see, the interesting thing that he says about this is that American politics, even though it was part of the British Empire and the structure of the colonies in some ways took their bearing from the nature of imperial rule, nevertheless, the political life as it began in America was essentially a local phenomenon. It's a bottom-up phenomenon. And Tocqueville makes a lot of this as to why our politics has the character that it does, the good things about our politics, some of the bad things about our politics, and especially he understands that this is what led to that mixture of regime structures that we saw unfold in the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Here on page 63, the first page of the chapter, a preliminary difficulty must be faced. The United States has a complex constitution. There are 2 distinct social structures, connected and, as it were, encased one within the other. One finds two complete separate and almost independent governments. The one is the ordinary and undefined government which provides for the daily needs of society, which he means the state and local dimensions of American political life, while the other is exceptional and circumscribed only by and only concerned with certain general interests. In a word, there are 24 little sovereign nations who together form the United States. Now, when we come to Chapter 8, where he talks about the rise of the federal constitution, you'll also see he repeats this theme of America being a complex kind of republic, a Montesquieuian notion of a republic over a league of republics. And even in that chapter, you'll see he got perfectly the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. More about that later. So, so Chapter 5 then begins the second half, the second part of Volume 1, Part 1, which is the nature of American political institutions. And again, you'll see it goes from Chapter 5, and then he talks about how the township, and the township is the institution of his closest examination, and you're going to see that the township is his model of what a decent democratic society looks like, um, with all its problems, and more about that later, of course. And then the state emerged, and then in chapters 6 and 7, which we'll talk briefly about, although those are interesting, he talks about two interesting features of American constitutionalism that developed in the colonies and the states, and then, of course, were incorporated into the federal constitution. And that's judicial review. Talks about the judiciary in chapter 6, uh, and you begin to think again. There's almost no critical feature of our American political system that Tocqueville didn't notice and comment on. And it's true, as you'll see. Judicial review is one of the most unique features. I'm sorry, I've used an expression which I'm most unique. There's no such thing as most unique. It's either unique or it isn't. There, I've said it. I corrected myself. Um, but uh, um, uh, but uh, he does understand. And oh, no, I was going to say is that even though this feature has been imitated in many modern constitutions, it was unique to America at this time. And even so, even though it has been imitated, it's often quite different. Like there are constitutional courts in many modern constitutions that imitate the role of the courts that de Tocqueville is talking about here. In chapter 6, what called political jurisdiction, it's actually political judgment in French, and you'll see what he's talking about is impeachment, which is a hot topic now, um, and he has some interesting things to say. And then chapter 8, which is the concluding chapter of this part, then details how the federal government came into being and its instincts and everything. And in this whole chapter, in this whole section of these 4 chapters, 5, 6, 7, and 8, remember the distinction between static and dynamic analysis. Um, there is a certain sense in which, for instance, 2 observations with respect to the federal constitution, which he made, is the relative weakness of the executive and the relative uh, circumscription of the federal role. Um, Both of those are profoundly different in our political system today. Although, again, as I said, even where Tocqueville's description of America seems outdated or no longer descriptive, he often puts in place the awareness of the fundamental uh, currents and forces that will transform that situation, as you'll see. So, um, so the second reason I said that this chapter was important for 2 reasons. One is because it begins the narrative of the emergence and nature of American political institutions, the parchment part of the regime, the institutional structure, and many of its laws. But this chapter is also central to articulating one of the Tocqueville's main analytical frameworks, which will be the basis of his analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of American society, and as you'll see, the framework that will allow him to predict where the direction of modern American government is going to go, and probably all modern democratic government. And that is the distinction between his discussion of centralization and decentralization, and his discussion of the different kinds of centralization and decentralization. This is a central part of his framework, and the unique features of the American political system, in this respect, he thought were some of its strongest aspects of America's Constitution, and and if modern democracy is to be saved, um, again, as I said, de Tocqueville, even though he thinks the coming of democracy is fated for humanity, that doesn't mean it will have a happy ending just because it's democratic. It turns out that democracy can give rise to very bad government, and it may ultimately have a destructive effect on the human soul. There, you're going to see that's where de Tocqueville goes with this. Um, but having said that, um, this aspect of this doctrine of centralization and decentralization again is a major analytic framework, and I'll try to kind of suggest how that framework emerges and what it means and how central it is to really his analysis of America and modern democracy in the rest of the book. So so American politics, again, going back to the first thing, the description of the emergence of American institutions. First, it was local, town, then state, then national. And in particular, his focus in the first part of the chapter is on the township. The township was essentially the English, the Puritan English way of organizing town on the most local level. On page 62, um, uh, he actually seems to suggest that township is kind of like this is kind of an Aristotelian notion, sort of like a step up from the tribe, because in Aristotle's Politics, you had the argument that human associations were threefold: the family, the village or the tribe, and then the city. And essentially, the first two are rooted in kinship and common body, the sexual bond of family, and the inherited property bond of daily life. And then the tribe or the village is kind of like an expanded association of families that grow too large for a single family. And then the city in Aristotle, and I think this is what de Tocqueville has in mind, the township, le commune in French, um, uh, is is his understanding of this kind of lowest level. And then in Aristotle's framework, by the way, then the city is the association of villages, and therefore it transcends kinship, and therefore that's why the polis, the city, the country, the nation, the political association is more an association and an idea and under laws rather than of kinship like the family or the tribe or village. But for Tocqueville, he spends a lot of time looking at this kind of emergence of political life at the moment where it's on the local level and therefore almost natural. On page and understand, he thinks that something like this is the essential feature of American political life on the local level, the most fundamental level. And he kind of goes from a description of it in the where the classic forms of it in the New York in the New England township, but really, and he notes as you go further south, it gets larger and also less intimate, and as always in the South, with the presence of slavery, it's somewhat affected by that. So on page 63, two, um, it is not by chance that I consider the township first. And then here's a little uh, discourse on the nature of it. Um, the township is the only association so well rooted in nature that wherever men assemble, it forms itself. Communal society therefore exists among all peoples, whatever be their customs and their laws. Man creates kingdoms and republics, but townships seem to spring directly from the hand of God. Another aspect of his religious rhetoric, something we'll be considering later on. But though townships are coeval with humanity, local freedom is a rare and fragile thing. Now, by the way, what he's pointing out here is he's trying to get to the unique nature of the spirit of American institutions, and he notes that almost all societies, even huge empires, have some kind of local government. But it's the relationship between the local units and the central units that is the critical distinction, and that's why his theoretical framework of centralization versus decentralization becomes so central in this chapter. Um, so uh, it would be useful conceptually for you to tie this emergence of American political institutions to his description of the point of departure in chapter 2, where the kind of instincts of the Puritan religious community, which highlighted individual liberty, but with and equality, but within the framework of communal responsibility. And again, just to remind you of the importance of American social instincts that he thinks political instincts that come out of there. Americans learned that the individual is free, and that essentially equal in dignity to all of the members of the community. That's, by the way, that's the message of Reformation Christianity. You could say perhaps that's the message of Christianity, and perhaps that's the message of the Bible. I in my scripture and politics class, we talked, and I actually think this goes back to the Cropsius dimensions of his article, where certain aspects of American political imagination do go back long, and are rooted not just in Roman and Greek political ideas or political terms and analysis, although much of the vocabulary of our life does come from that, but really are rooted in fundamental views of humanity in the Bible, especially the notion of equality and freedom. I think if you look at Genesis, you can argue that the notion that human beings are free and equal is actually rooted in the biblical notion of the image of God. Um, but that's a long concept. But anyway, um, um, in the founding of America, it was critical that our point of departure, that our launching pad socially and religiously, were the Puritans. Because again, the other thing that they managed to do, in addition to infusing the sense of equality and liberty, was to connect that sense of liberty and equality with devotion and responsibility to the community and participation in it, kind of like an anti-federalist theme, and also the idea that you can't have liberty without law. And de Tocqueville, like many other, and remember our discussion of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists from Story's book. Um, Ultimately, you can't have free government unless you have law, and keeping the spirit of law and the attachment of citizens to law is one of the major projects that de Tocqueville and the anti-federalists, as you're going to see, and some would argue that that may point to dangerous currents in emergent American and other global tendencies. So, here you have a nice summary of what he thinks that point of departure in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 2, and how it relates to the instincts of the smallest level of political community. On the bottom, 62 and 63. However, the strength of the peoples that keep freedom in their lives, and by freedom and liberty, de Tocqueville means the same thing that our founders meant. It's not only individual liberty, um, uh, and, uh, and personal liberty to do what you want to do, but also liberty to participate in the larger life of the community. That's what the American point of departure in Chapter 2 suggested, and why he thinks the township, and especially local institutions themselves, are so critical to the preservation of free government and free society on earth. To continue with a quote, local institutions are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They put it within the people's reach. They teach people to appreciate its peaceful enjoyment and accustom them to make use of it. Without local institutions, a nation may give itself a free government, but it has not got the spirit of liberty. Passing passions, momentary interests, or chance circumstance may give it the external shape of independence. But the despotic tendencies which have been driven into the interior of the body social will sooner or later break out on the surface. So you're going to see, and as his analysis unfolds, and we look into the heart of American character and the larger parts of the regime and our social habits and inclinations and mental life and emotional life of the American people, this idea of of the centrality of local institutions preserving the best of America becomes a major theme of his teaching. So if you're looking on the notes, turn to page 5, um, and here his description of turn to page 87, which is where the theoretical framework that he begins to erect in this chapter uh, is begin to lay out the political effects of administrative decentralization in the United States. So here's his core definition of what centralization versus decentralization and political or governmental uh, uh, I use both governmental and political as he does versus administrative. And since you are college students and you understand essential mathematics, you know that 2 times 2 equals 4. And you're going to see in this grid where I've laid out on the top of the notes on page 5, um, uh, what he thinks the 4 potential arrangements of governmental institutions in this respect are. So on page 87, the core definition and introduction to the topic. Centralization now is a word constantly repeated, but one that, generally speaking, no one tries to define accurately. There are, however, two distinct kinds of centralization which need to be well understood. Certain interests, such as the enactment of general laws and the nation's relations with foreigners, are common to all parts of the nation. There are other interests of special concern to certain parts of the nation, such, for instance, local enterprises. To concentrate all of the former general interests of the nation in the same place or under the same directing power is to establish what I call governmental centralization or political centralization. To concentrate control of the latter in the same way is to establish what I call administrative centralization. There are some points at which these two forms of sorts of centralization become confused, but by broadly classifying the matters that fall more particularly within the province of each, the distinction can be made. So, if you're looking at the grid, taking this definition and see, you can see that uh, the two columns and the two rows make four possible combinations. With respect, so on the left side are centralization versus decentralization, and on the top are political or governmental centralization versus administrative centralization. And so you'll see uh, uh, the top two, uh, uh, the, the the two row, the top row does describe the U.S. When you had governmental decentralization, which is to say, there was no you have the Articles of Confederation. So in the upper left-hand corner, that's the Articles of Confederation, and the defects of it. It was both decentralized in terms of political will of the nation. Again, to go back to that founding debate, Americans wanted to be a nation, but under the theory of the Articles, you couldn't have it and still have a free government. So the aim was to create a confederation, but a confederation has no core political centralization, no ability to express the will of the nation. In order to express the will and the good of the nation, you have to have a national center, a real government, and that's political and governmental. So under the Articles, the problem was the Articles were both politically and then also administratively decentralized. So, for instance, under the Articles, there was no executive branch, no judicial branch. So even those laws which the central government under the Articles were capable of forming, some commercial regulation, treaties, and everything, they were only administered and interpreted on the state level, which meant, of course, when you had that radical administrative decentralization, you might have had one common treaty for the nation, one common policy announced by the Congress. But if the only way to interpret and apply it was through local institutions, then in essence you ended up having 13 different uh, 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 versions of that law. So, uh, um, as you're going to see, if you turn then to the right side of the top row, where you have governmental centralization and administrative decentralization. This is what he thinks the Constitution has accomplished, where you have a common nation and common laws that now apply to all of the people, but that, like the interstate highway system, even though it's a federal program, a national program, it's actually the states that administer it. And that's why there are different speed limits on different states, even though, again, there's a nice, perfect image of what he means by governmental centralization and administrative decentralization. Now, in the bottom row, um, let's be clear that on the left side, where you have political governmental decentralization and administrative centralization, I think actually the Tocqueville thinks that's a null set. You really can't have a nation that's decentralized politically and has administrative decentralization. Uh, for there to be administrative centralization, which means the day-to-day business of running life, it falls under governmental administration and is centralized into one unit. Um, is you can't have that unless there's a kind of some kind of institutional a floor of the national will with political. So I actually think in that corner, the left hand lower corner, it's a theoretical possibility, but it's not practical. And he doesn't give any examples of such a thing because probably again that really can't exist. But in the lower right hand corner, where you have governmental centralization and administrative centralization, that is, I think, he thinks the worst of all possible existing worlds and is probably the end point, not only of American politics eventually, but of modern democracy overall. And so you're going to see, as de Tocqueville's analysis unfolds, the cultural and spiritual and intellectual dimensions of living in a democracy will eventually be bound, and the habits of the citizens will eventually be bound up with um, the tendency of government to eat up more of the functions of life and to turn them into issues of both regulation and administration, and to absorb all those energies and eventually to control them from a national center. Um, now, that's as you're going to see what he's going to predict in Volume 2, Part 4, where he kind of directs his attention to the future of humanity. Now, why that's bad and why it's probably likely, and what causes that, believe me, you'll see plenty of examples of that analysis from all points of view in this book. So, what's at stake? Uh, Turn to page, just a couple of quotes, and why he, what's so you're going to have to see, why is governmental centralization and administrative centralization such a why is that such a temptation for modern democracy, and why is it likely that once all the other props and supporters of citizen virtue and everything, the things the anti-federalists cared about, why is it that modern democracy is probably going to head in that direction, and what its bad effects will be? You get some sense of that on page 91 and 95. It is true that centralization can easily succeed in imposing an external uniformity on men's behavior, and that uniformity comes to be loved for itself, without reference to its objects. Just as the pious may adore a statue, forgetting the divinity it represents. Centralization easily imposes an aspect of regularity on day-to-day business. It can regulate the details of social life skillfully, check slight disorders and petty offenses, maintain the status quo of society, which cannot properly be called either decadence or progress, and keep society in that state of administrative somnolence, which administrators are in the habit of calling good order and public tranquility. Shut up and get in line. In a word, it exceeds at preventing, not doing. When it is a question of deeply stirring society or getting it in a rapid pace, its strength deserts it. Once its measures require any aid from individuals, this vast machine turns out to be astonishingly feeble, and suddenly it is reduced to impotence. Um, you're going to see that part of his analysis that feeds, for instance, his awareness of the division of the future world into two camps that he predicts it in the conclusion to Volume 1, Part 2. The division of the world up between the Americans and the Russians. It isn't, again, because of geopolitical. Part of that is geopolitical, but it's because he comes to see that the modern democratic future is going to be determined by two poles of democracy. And yes, as you're going to see, the two institutional poles of modern democracy are political centralization and administrative decentralization, which he thinks is the strength of America and the unique aspect of American democracy, versus political and administrative centralization, which was present, by the way, in both the pre-revolutionary French bureaucratic and post-revolutionary French bureaucratic. It was present in the Tsarist regime and in the Stalinist regime that replaced the Stalinist, and is in the heart, in some ways, of the People's Republic of China. So this is a critical framework, um, uh, um, and as you're going to see, it becomes the key to his understanding the whole future of humanity. On page 95, what I most admire in America is not the administrative, but the political effects of decentralization. In the United States, the motherland's presence is felt everywhere. You see American flags everywhere. You know, everyone stands up well, used to stand up at a baseball game, whatever. But in other words, there's something like the presence of America here, even among local life and private life. It is a subject of concern to the village and to the whole Union. Um, the inhabitants care about each of their country's interests as if it was their own. Each man takes pride in the nation. The successes it gains seem his own work, and he becomes elated. He rejoices in the general prosperity from which he profits. He has much the same feeling for his country as one has for one's family, um, um, and sort of selfishness makes him care for the state. This is going to be this paragraph is very meaty, very weighty eventually, especially in volume 2, where he's going to argue what America has done up till this point and beyond is linked each person's sense of self-interest with the good of the community, which is what all political community has to do. Often to a European, a public official stands for horse. To an American, he stands for right. Not, and obviously some things have changed. Um, but anyway, so that's the critical framework. So let's quickly dance through um, chapter 6 and 7, finish up with chapter 8, and then we'll turn to an introduction to the very meaty and weighty half of volume 2 and part 2. So uh, chapter 6 is on the judiciary and the remarkable power of judicial review. Um, so, uh, um, although the American courts, I'm reading from my notes, plays the same functions that all courts do, and he lists in the opening of this chapter the three aspects of judicial power that he discusses in the first pages of the chapter: arbitrator of disputes and rights, operating in specific cases rather than general cases, very Lockean, by the way, and passive rather than active. Courts act through cases, and cases have to come to it. He says those are universal aspects of judicial power wherever courts are found. American constitutionalists give the courts the power to interpret the Constitution as a legal standard in cases. Now, I have to tell you, and we explore this much more in my constitutional law class, where we talk about the different theory of the judiciary and judicial review. There's no question that this idea sort of began to emerge in the states, but it really isn't until the federal Constitution and the Federalist aspects, especially under Alexander Hamilton and Chief Justice John Marshall, that this full aspect of American constitutionalism emerges. So, so look on the bottom of 100 and the top of 101. So, an American judge is exactly like the magistrates of other nations. However, he is invested with immense political power. How does this come about? He moves within the same sphere, employing the same means as other judges. Why does he have a power which others, non American judges, have not? The reason lies in this one fact: the Americans have given their judges the right to base their decisions on the Constitution rather than on the laws. In other words, they allow them not to apply laws which they consider unconstitutional. Um, um, I know that similar right has been sometimes claimed by courts in other lands, but it has never been conceded. And if you want to follow this nice theme, which a nice fine book by a great constitutional scholar, which I use in my constitutional law class, Edward Corwin, The Higher Law Background of American Constitutional Law. It's an amplification of this sentence of de Tocqueville, where he explains why British courts, which evolved much of the foundation, operation, and structure of American law, our court system is really an Anglo-American court system, um, and on the continent, the continental justice system operates in several profound ways because it derived more from Roman and Napoleonic influences than from the British common law. But as Corwin points out, what de Tocqueville mentions is that the English Constitution never really developed a full doctrine of judicial review because the judges were appointed by the Crown. Now, the current state in the British Constitution is a little bit different. It has to do with some change in the function of the House of Lords, but that's a different subject. So this means that the judiciary, which is the least political branch in America, has a critical political power. And just look at any. And by the way, where does that lead to? He says that this tends to politicize the judiciary, and often it has a tendency to turn all political questions into judicial questions. Look at critical controversies in our law, such as abortion or health care. There is a certain sense in which, or same-sex marriage, or these kinds of things. Once the court embraced these issues under constitutional interpretation, it took political issues that would be divided, say, by legislatures or by Congress, or even by other popular elections, and turned them into judicial questions, and the courts decided that, often covering up really deep and profound simmering political differences. I'm not advocating or criticizing this, but he got it exactly right, and he had a tendency to see that this power would probably be more expansive as time would go by, with both positive and negative effects on the country. Chapter 7, political jurisdiction, is again what he means by political jurisdiction is hiring and firing people for administrative reasons, and what he calls is really what he's calling impeachment and removal from office. So here's a nice discussion of what he means by this on pages 108 and 109. Um, um, so in this matter, the Americans have created a mixed system. The formalities of a political trial are required for administrative dismissal, and political jurisdiction has been deprived of its severe sanctions. In other words, to some degree, to get rid of people, aside from like fire them in the bureaucracy or something like that, was to cut their heads off, like Charles I in 1649 or Louis XVI in 1789. Um, uh, but by preserving, by creating, and what is impeachment or what's called political jurisdiction, where primarily the legislative body, so there could be other unique bodies that perform this function. Um, uh, they they essentially kick somebody out of office, which both limits and we're seeing this unfold perhaps. And by the way, this is in other words an institutional version of the recall provision, which exists in 3 state constitutions, and that's what California is going through right now. So uh, you could say the great thing about impeachment, as Americans use them, is you don't have to assassinate people. You can fire them through an institutional process, or unelect them, by the way, either in the next election or, as in the 3 states like Wisconsin, California, I can't remember the third state that has a recall. You can unelect them through a special election. And that means that getting somebody out of political power is a milder and safer procedure in America. Interesting thing. And his essence is to say this is an administrative procedure that's dressed up as a judicial or political body. The House becomes a kind of a grand jury, and this is true in the states that all the states that have this feature, and they all do, by the way. And the Senate then becomes a kind of a trial, even though they're technically legislative institutions. So, all right, let's turn to chapter 8. And um, and now this is the federal constitution, and he has nice things to say about it. Again, like William Gladstone, the great English prime minister, who I always mangle this quote, but I get it essentially right. That the U.S. Constitution was the greatest work of the mind of man and never struck off in a single time and place. On page 113, if there ever was a short moment where America did rise to that climax of glory, where the proud imagination of her inhabitants would constantly like us to see her, he got the idea that Americans like to brag about their country in other countries when they're visiting, which makes Americans odious when they go visit other countries. And I have to say, I've been to both Egypt and to India and Israel for that matter. But in Egypt and India, I was with 12 other professors, and it's true, by the way. Americans are generally embarrassing when they're visiting other countries, but here he says, if Americans ever would want to be proud of their country, it was at that supreme crisis when the national authority had in some sort abdicated its dominion, the failures of the Articles. The spectacle of a nation struggling energetically to obtain the independence is one which every country is. Moreover, he kind of downplays the intensity and the sense of the revolutionary struggle. Moreover, the efforts made by the Americans to throw off the English yoke have been much exaggerated with 2,800 miles of ocean between them and their enemies, although you have to remember that the British Empire summoned the largest expeditionary force in its history to try to subdue the American Revolution. So he may actually underestimate the fighting spirit of Americans when it came to their own liberty. Anyway, aided by a powerful ally, les Français, the United States owed their victory much more to their position than to the valor of their armies or the patriotism of their citizens. And there is some truth that when you read, again, Ron Chernow's great book on Washington, which is his double companion volume to his one on Hamilton, um, uh, there's no question that Washington and the commander-in-chief was ready to tear his hair out or pull out his wooden teeth because how bad the Continental Army was, but that's a different issue. When France um, would dare to compare the American war to those of the French Revolution or the efforts of the Americans to ours when France, a prey to the attacks of all Europe without money, credit, or allies, threw a 20th of her population in the face of her enemies with one hand stifling the devouring flames, um, uh, with the other brandishing of the torch around her. But back to America and the Constitutional Convention. But that which is new in the history of societies is to see a great people, warned by its lawgivers that the wheels of government are stopping, turn its attention on itself without haste or fear, sound the depths of the ill, and then wait for 2 years to find the remedy at leisure. And then finally, when the remedy has been indicated, submit it to voluntarily without costing humanity a single tear or drop of blood. I agree with that description. As does Storing, by the way, when the inadequacy of the first federal constitution was first felt, that outburst of political passions which gave birth to the revolution had somewhat calmed down. But all the great men then thrown into the front were still alive. That proved a double blessing for America. The assembly responsible for drafting the second constitution was not numerous, 55 people, with 39 really participating, and it included the men of greatest intelligence and noblest character ever to have appeared in the New World. George Washington presided over it. Okay, so that has nice things to say about the American Constitution, and and by the way, he gets exactly what the fundamental nature of the small republic versus the large republic, a small republic, a confederation of small republics, which was the image of American institutions that the Anti-Federalists had, and the notion of a vast and complex and diverse national republic composed of individuals. On page 118, one party wanted to make the Union a league of independent states, a sort of Congress where representatives of distinct peoples came to discuss certain matters of common interest. Perfect description of the small republicanism and confederalism of the Anti-Federalists. The other party wished to unite all the inhabitants of the former colonies in a single people, and to give them a government which, though its sphere would be limited, could act within that sphere as the one and only representative of the nation. The practical consequences of these two theories were widely divergent. Okay, and he follows, somewhat replicates in a couple of paragraphs the nature of the founding debate. So again, you have this uniqueness of the overarching American political system as a nation over one national republic over small semi-sovereign state republics, and which then led back to this framework in Chapter 5 of this unique mixture of political and governmental centralization and administrative decentralization. Now, he does conclude that that uh, uh, so what is the nature of the federal government that he sees? What that he describes then? And uh, uh, he says the scope of the national government was relatively limited. Um, the weakness of the executive compared to the other branches of government, and you might say here again, because of his ability to see the eventual triumph of administrative centralization, that both the limited scope of the national government and the relative weakness of the executive has been replaced by really a nationally dominated political society and an executive dominated political society. We see issues about that in almost every modern presidency. And he did, by the way, predict that the presidential election could be dangerous because it could be the basis of profound and deep factionalism. When we come to Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 2 on parties, you're going to see what he calls great versus small parties and more about that. But he was aware that the presidential election could become a great divisive national event, as it did in 1860, perhaps in 2016, and perhaps in 2022. So, all right. So, uh, with that in mind, let's turn now to Volume 1, Part 2. And um, the you're looking at the last page of notes, page 6. On the top, I take you through the 10 chapters, the layout of Volume 1, Part 2. Let's just walk through that. Now, Chapter 1 is very short. We're going to read almost the entirety of it. And the meatiness of this short chapter compares to Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 4 on the sovereignty of the people. And that brief chapter should be read in connection with this brief chapter. And in it, you'll see he argues that the United States truly is a democracy, contrary to what the Marxists say, or etc. But you're going to see, you have to understand what he means by that. And so, really, the theme of Volume 1, Part 2 is, after we've seen the pre-political and ideational and institutional evolution of the American Republic, now let's see how it works. How does is this regime democratic? And if so, how does it operate as a democratic form of government and society? And this is what he's going to examine. And what we'll be examining from chapters 1 to 4, really after chapter 1, 2 through 4, are what you could call the mechanisms of how democracy, how the majority actually exerts its influence over society and politics. You're going to see in chapter 1, he's going to argue this is a democracy. Why? Because it's really majority rule. And then the next question is not it is an institutional question, but it's more like a transitional question between civil society and institutional life. What are the three aspects, parties, press, and associations, by which the majority forms, becomes aware of itself, and becomes a political factor in our politics? And then chapter 5 um, uh, and 6 is leads to what he actually then in chapter 5 he said, okay, so now that you see how that the majority rules and the mechanisms by which it rules, what is it actually like to live in a country that's a functioning democracy? And you're going to see in chapter 5 there's bad and good, and that leads to perhaps one of the profoundest and deepest chapters, which we'll spend some time on in chapter 6, where this is his great comparison. This chapter, chapter 6, connects with the broad purposes of the book. Uh, that is to say, what's the moment, the Tocquevillian moment? He's standing, as you had already seen from the author's introduction, in this great focal point, this fulcrum between the aristocratic and royal past of humanity and the coming democratic centuries of the human race. And, and what chapter 6 is what I call the great comparison. So when you sum everything up, how it which is better, the aristocratic past or the democratic future? And you'll see, by the way, you would think, well, wait a minute, didn't he say that in chapter 4 of part 1, volume 1, that sovereignty of the people is the true doctrine, and there isn't this moving from falseness to truth? There is some truth to that, but as you're going to see, um, he has good things to say about aristocracy, and has some, and in the next two chapters, you'll see especially, he has some bad things to say about democracy. Every form of government can go wrong. Every form of government can get some things right, um, and and therefore it's critical for not only for that generation of Europe, but for the future legislators of democratic society, who will eventually get up to the steering wheel and drive the engine, drive the vehicle. It's critical for you to understand how good democracy is and why, and some of the good things that aristocracy had. But it's also critical for you to understand how dangerous democracy can be and its great evils. And those are laid out in chapters 7 and 8, where he is, as I've already said before, and that's why these two chapters bear remarkable attention, intense attention, because he lays out the most problematic and tyrannical tendencies of democracy, majority tyranny, that Madison in Federalist 10 was the great author of and explainer of. But here, de Tocqueville is the deepest writer on politics, ancient or modern, east or west, to go into uh, uh, the essential currents and nature of democratic rule, and to show how it can culminate in tyranny, and perhaps a new kind of tyranny never before seen in the human race. So, and then, so, in chapter 8 is elements that temper majority tyranny, and um, and okay, and then 9 and 10 are the concluding chapters of Volume 1, Part 2. Elements that may preserve a democratic republic. That is to say, if you presume that the American experiment in democratic republicanism is a good thing, what are the elements that may preserve its best elements? And you'll see there are some complex ones. And this is where, again, he starts to sound like an anti-federalist, because he thinks religious faith maybe a critical aspect in the preservation of American republicanism. And then chapter 10, which we'll spend a good deal of portion of time on, his rather sober vision of the current state of the three races, the Native Americans, African Americans, and European Americans, Anglo Americans, and the likely future of these three races, which has some potent, grim, and encouraging observations. And then, so let's look at the first four chapters uh, of volume 1, part 2. So this very short chapter, only a couple of paragraphs, uh, why it can be strictly said that the people govern in the United States. In America, the people appoint both those who make the laws and those who execute them. The people form the jury, which punishes breaches of the law. The institutions are democratic not only in the principle, but in all their developments. Thus, the people directly nominate their representatives and generally choose them annually or semi-annually so as to hold them completely dependent. So, direction really comes from the people. And though the form of government is representative or republican, it is clear that the opinions, prejudices, interests, and even passions, this is the critical part, of the people can find no lasting obstacles preventing them from being manifest in the daily conduct of society. In the United States, as in all countries where the people reign, the majority rules in the name of the people. The majority is chiefly composed of peaceful citizens, middle class citizens. And when we turn to chapter 5, you'll see he amplifies the economic foundation of the middle class that began in chapter 3 of volume 1, part 1. And it becomes perhaps one of the most sophisticated class analysis of modern society. And we'll see that in chapter 5 of part 2 of volume 1. Sincerely designing the well being of the country, they are surrounded by the constant education of parties seeking to draw them in and elicit support. So, what does it mean to say that America is really a democracy, not a bunch of corporate elites like finger puppets or dangling the? But here's his point: that when a majority forms in America, if it is widespread and long-lasting enough, because there are many institutional obstacles, some other economic and social obstacles between translating the instant will of a majority that forms into instant public policy, which again the framers did reject in Federalist 10 as democracy, which is why the problem of democracy. But his point is this is a democratic republic, and what does that mean? Contrary to Marx, contrary to the people who argue that this is an oligarchy. When, and here's, you may or may not buy this, but this is what he means by it. When a passion, an interest, or an opinion seizes a majority of Americans and is widespread enough and long term enough, ultimately all the institutions of government will vibrate according to that. That's what he means by calling America a democracy. So, very briefly, to finish the next few chapters, then how does this majority form? How does it become aware of itself as a majority? How does it know what it wants? And how does its influence spread and become a political influence? And the three mediating structures that he discusses in chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 are parties, political parties. And that, by the way, his designation of parties in that chapter roughly follows uh, Madison's description of factions. Now, the most important thing in chapter 2 is his distinction between great parties and small parties. And it depends on what kind of booze you have and what state you live on. If it's, no, I'm just kidding. So, all right, page 175. What I call great political parties are those more attached to principles than consequence. Such parties generally have noble features, more generous passions, more real convictions, bolder and more open. Private interest, which always plays the greatest part in political passions, is there more skillfully concealed. So, small parties, on the other hand, are generally without political faith. They are not elevated and sustained by lofty purposes. The selfishness of their characters is openly displayed in all their actions. They glow with a factious zeal. Their language is violent. So, by the way, great parties aren't necessarily uh, parties that include massive parts of the population, although they may. And small parties are not necessarily minority parties. What he's talking about, the great and small parties, are political parties that have vast differences, where you almost have two different visions of the nation. And by the way, there's no question that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists at one point did constitute great parties, but the Federalists lost, and within the surviving Constitutionalist Party, you got modes of operation of expanding or contracting federal power. Slavery and the North and the South constituted a great party division, where you had two profound different views of human nature and American citizenship. Um, but by and large, Tocqueville argues that most of our party competition, Republican, Democrat, is actually small parties, because even though the Republican Democratic parties have like liberal, conservative, blah 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 blah. Generally speaking, like both parties today advocate the same vision of America: a moderate welfare state, relative strength in foreign policy, some and so forth. So now, I do think that this distinction is interesting in raising the question of whether we are moving into a period where the small differences between Republican and Democrat, because of polarization on all other kinds of forces, are moving into a kind of great party competition with a kind of polarization that may be tearing society apart. we'll come back to this. The press. He thinks that the free press is one of the major instruments because what the free press does, it means the instant circulation of political opinion throughout the country. And the amazing thing is, when he wrote, there weren't national media; there were only local newspapers, some like and big, some nationwide newspapers like the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. But of course, I think everything that he says about the press is even more apropos in a period of electronic media, first with radio and then television and then the internet and social media. And his point is, and look at our language has accommodated this with the idea of something going viral. That means that an opinion that starts at one part of the country through the nature of social media, the internet, and even television suddenly becomes spread throughout the country. I actually think that the introduction development of electronic media have made this chapter on the press even more. And again, that's to some degree, it's even been enforced by the rise of public opinion polling, which it increasingly puts the force of a national Democratic majority in front of us, Democratic small d, I mean, and associations. So in chapter 4, he thinks this is the great link between individuals and communities. He has wonderful things to say about associations. And he's right, by the way. Now, again, uh, uh, he says this is the key to how individuals in America see themselves as being able to exercise influence on society. And he's right about this. My favorite example was Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Uh, uh, Prior to this organization, almost all the states in the union had pretty liberal drunk driving statutes. And then a California mother's son was killed by a drunk driver. She started Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It became a nationwide association. All of a sudden, both on the federal and the state level, all of a sudden we have a different nation today than you did. And de Tocqueville is quite right that this is how this is the link between the individual and the ability to have a society. All kinds of critical examples of this exist where people formed private associations that became public associations and influenced the political party debate and everything. All right, we'll stop here, and after the midterm, we'll pick up his profound study of the instincts of democratic rule in America.